The yellow curtains in Emma Chen's kitchen still hung the same way they had on that October morning in 2002, catching the early sunlight just as they did the day her 3-year-old daughter Lily disappeared. 15 years had passed, yet Emma couldn't bring herself to change them, as if moving anything might somehow erase the last traces of the little girl who once stood on a wooden stool, pressing her small hands against the glass, watching for her father's truck to pull into their driveway in Millbrook Falls, a quiet town nestled in the hills of western Pennsylvania. If you've ever known the weight of an unanswered question that changes everything, you understand why some stories refuse to stay buried. Subscribe to hear more about the mysteries that reshape entire communities. The morning Lily vanished began like any other. Emma remembered the details with the clarity that trauma burns into memory. The smell of coffee brewing, the sound of cartoons playing softly in the living room, the way Lily's blonde curls caught the light as she colored at the kitchen table. Emma had stepped into the laundry room for what couldn't have been more than 3 minutes to switch loads. When she returned, the front door stood slightly ajar, and Lily was gone. The search that followed consumed Millbrook Falls. Neighbors abandoned their Saturday morning routines to comb through the dense woods surrounding the Chen property. The volunteer fire department deployed every available resource. State police established a command center in the high school gymnasium, where Emma and her husband David waded through endless hours of questions, polygraph tests, and the grinding machinery of an investigation that seemed to produce everything except their daughter. Detective Sarah Kowalski, then a rookie with the Pennsylvania State Police, remembered walking through those woods for weeks afterward, even after the official search had been scaled back. You develop a sixth sense about these cases, she would later reflect. Something about the way the family dynamics played out, the inconsistencies in David Chen's timeline, the neighbors who mentioned hearing raised voices the week before. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle scattered in different rooms. David Chen worked construction, a man whose hands bore the evidence of 20 years building other people's homes while struggling to hold his own family together. Friends described him as a devoted father who taught Lily to ride her tricycle and read her bedtime stories in both English and Mandarin. But Emma's sister Michelle had confided to investigators about the tension she'd observed during family gatherings, how David's patience seemed to have limits, especially after he'd been drinking. The initial investigation focused heavily on the possibility that Lily had simply wandered off. 3-year-olds were notorious for their curiosity and their inability to gauge danger. The woods behind their house stretched for miles, connecting to state game lands where a small child could easily become lost. Search dogs traced Lily's scent to the edge of the tree line before losing it completely, a detail that haunted investigators for years. But other evidence painted a more troubling picture. The house showed signs of a recent cleaning, unusual for a Saturday morning. David's story about his whereabouts the previous evening contained gaps that he couldn't adequately explain. A neighbor reported hearing what sounded like furniture being moved around the Chen house very late Friday night, well past the time when most families with young children would be settling down for the evening. Emma's world collapsed inward. She took leave from her job at the county clerk's office and spent her days posting flyers, organizing search parties, and maintaining a website with Lily's photograph. A smiling toddler with bright eyes and an infectious laugh that seemed to reach out from every missing child poster throughout the tri-state area. The local news covered the story extensively for the first few months, but as leads dried up and no trace of Lily emerged, media attention inevitably shifted to newer tragedies. David's behavior grew increasingly erratic as the investigation intensified. He hired a lawyer, stopped cooperating fully with police, and began drinking more heavily. The marriage, already strained by the trauma of their daughter's disappearance, began to fracture under the weight of suspicion and grief. Emma found herself caught between defending her husband and confronting the possibility that the man she'd married might know more about Lily's fate than he was admitting. The case eventually went cold, but Detective Kowalski kept Lily's file on her desk. She would review it periodically, looking for connections she might have missed, following up on tips that continued to trickle in from across the country. Parents who thought they'd seen a child matching Lily's description, reports of suspicious vehicles, anonymous phone calls that usually led nowhere but occasionally contained details that kept the investigation technically active. Emma and David divorced 2 years after Lily's disappearance. Emma remained in Millbrook Falls, unable to abandon the place where her daughter had last been seen, while David moved across the country to Oregon, claiming he needed to start over somewhere without constant reminders. The house where they'd raised Lily was sold, but Emma would drive by it sometimes, wondering if new owners had any idea of the grief that had once filled those rooms. The town of Millbrook Falls carried the weight of Lily Chen's disappearance in the way small communities do, as a shared trauma that subtly altered how parents watched their children, how neighbors looked out for each other, and how everyone secretly wondered about the family that had lived among them. Local schools implemented new safety protocols. Parents became more cautious about letting children play outside unsupervised. The case became part of the town's collective memory, a reminder that tragedy could strike anywhere, even in a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Years passed. Emma remarried. A kind man named Robert who understood that her heart would always carry a space reserved for Lily. She learned to live with uncertainty, to function despite the absence of closure. But she never stopped hoping that somewhere, somehow, her daughter was alive and would one day find her way home. By 2017, Dr. Marcus Webb had been practicing pediatric medicine at Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh for nearly a decade. His specialty in treating childhood trauma and abuse had earned him a reputation as a physician who could see beyond surface injuries to identify patterns of harm that others might miss. It was this expertise that would eventually connect him to a case that had been dormant for 15 years. The patient who would change everything was a 17-year-old named Ashley Martinez, brought to the emergency room by her foster parents after a skateboarding accident. The injury itself was minor, a sprained wrist from attempting a trick that exceeded her skill level. But as Dr. Webb reviewed Ashley's x-rays, his trained eye caught something that made him pause and look more carefully. Ashley's medical history revealed a pattern of bone fractures that told a story more complex than typical childhood accidents. Multiple healing fractures in her arms and ribs, occurring at different times during her early childhood, suggested repeated trauma rather than the random injuries that active children typically sustained. Most concerning were several fractures to her skull that had healed years ago, injuries that would have required significant force to inflict. In pediatric medicine, we're trained to recognize the difference between accidental injuries and those caused by abuse. Dr. Webb later explained. Ashley's x-rays showed what we call a signature pattern, multiple fractures in various stages of healing, located in areas that are rarely injured accidentally. These were the bones of a child who had been systematically hurt. Ashley herself seemed unaware of the significance of her old injuries. She had no memory of the fractures, which wasn't unusual given that they had occurred when she was very young. Her earliest clear memories began around age 5, when she entered the foster care system in Ohio. Before that, everything was hazy, fragments of images and feelings that she couldn't quite piece together into a coherent narrative. The foster care system had been Ashley's reality for most of her conscious life. She'd been placed with 7 different families over 12 years, each placement failing for various reasons. Behavioral issues that stemmed from early trauma, difficulty forming attachments, and the simple reality that older children were harder to place permanently. Despite these challenges, Ashley had found stability with her current foster family, the Martinezes, who had taken her in 3 years earlier when she was 14. Dr. Webb faced an ethical dilemma. Ashley was now 17, nearly aged out of the foster care system, and seemed to be thriving with the Martinezes. Reopening questions about her early childhood trauma could be deeply disruptive. But the pattern of injuries he'd identified suggested that somewhere in Ashley's past, a serious crime had been committed against a very young child. Someone had hurt her repeatedly, and that person had never been held accountable. Following protocol, Dr. Webb contacted the Pennsylvania Department of Human Services. Ashley's case was assigned to social worker Janet Morrison, a 20-year veteran who had seen enough cases of child abuse to recognize the significance of Dr. Webb's findings. Morrison began the delicate process of investigating Ashley's background, starting with her entry into the Ohio foster care system in 2007. The records told a troubling story. Ashley had been found by police officers conducting a welfare check at a motel in Youngstown, Ohio. She was approximately 5 years old, malnourished, and alone. The room had been abandoned, with no indication of who had left her there or how long she'd been by herself. The little girl couldn't provide her real name or any information about her family. She had been trained to call herself Ashley and seemed genuinely terrified of authority figures. What struck Morrison as she reviewed the files was how thoroughly someone had attempted to erase Ashley's identity. She had no documentation, no birth certificate, no medical records, no school enrollment history. It was as if she had simply materialized in that Ohio motel room, a frightened child with no past and no way to explain how she'd gotten there. The investigation that followed Ashley's discovery in 2007 had been thorough, but ultimately futile. Police checked missing children databases across multiple states, compared Ashley's photograph to hundreds of missing child reports, and conducted extensive interviews. But without any concrete leads or identifying information, the case eventually stalled. Ashley was placed in foster care with the assumption that she was either an abandoned child whose family couldn't be located or a victim of trafficking who had been deliberately separated from any traceable identity. Dr. Webb's discovery of the bone fractures added a new dimension to Ashley's story. The injuries provided a timeline. They had occurred when Ashley was between 2 and 4 years old, based on the healing patterns visible in the x-rays. This meant that somewhere, a family was missing, a toddler who had suffered significant abuse, and a crime had been covered up so completely that a child's very existence had been erased. Morrison began expanding her search, looking at missing children cases from the early 2000s that might match Ashley's approximate age and physical description. The process was painstaking. Thousands of children go missing each year, and many cases involving very young children contain limited physical evidence or reliable identifying information. Meanwhile, Ashley continued her senior year of high school, unaware that her past was being excavated by strangers. The Martinezes had mentioned that she was adopted, but she'd never pressed for details about her biological family. The foster care system was the only family structure she remembered, and she had learned early that some questions were better left unasked. But changes began to surface in Ashley's behavior that concerned her foster parents. She started having nightmares, fragmented dreams that she couldn't quite remember but that left her distressed and confused. Sometimes she would wake up speaking what sounded like fragments of another language, words that none of them could identify. During therapy sessions that were part of her foster care support plan, she began recovering scattered memories from her earliest years. Images of yellow curtains, the smell of coffee, and a woman's voice singing lullabies. Dr. Webb continued to consult on the case, reviewing Ashley's medical records and consulting with specialists in childhood trauma. The pattern of injuries was consistent with what experts called systematic abuse, not random acts of violence, but repeated harm inflicted over an extended period. The skull fractures were particularly concerning, as they suggested injuries that could have been fatal if not treated. As Morrison's investigation expanded, she began to recognize that Ashley's case might be connected to other unsolved mysteries. The thoroughness with which someone had erased her identity suggested criminal sophistication that went beyond typical child abandonment cases. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that this little girl could never be connected to her original identity. The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to emerge, but Morrison knew that solving cases involving very young children required a different approach. Memory, documentation, and physical evidence all became more fragmented when the victims were too young to advocate for themselves. Ashley's story would require patience, expertise, and a willingness to follow leads that had been cold for more than a decade. Janet Morrison had developed a systematic approach to investigating cases like Ashley's over her 2 decades in child protective services. She understood that finding connections between missing children and unidentified foster children required meticulous attention to detail and a willingness to explore cases that others might have written off as unsolvable. Ashley's distinctive bone fracture patterns gave Morrison something concrete to search for, a medical signature that might match missing child reports from the early 2000s. Morrison's first breakthrough came when she accessed the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children database, specifically searching for cases involving toddlers who had disappeared between 2000 and 2005. She filtered her search by geographic region, focusing initially on Pennsylvania and surrounding states, then gradually expanding her parameters. The process was tedious, but Morrison had learned that patience often distinguished successful investigations from those that remained forever cold. The case of Lily Chen appeared in Morrison's search results on a gray February afternoon in 2018. The photograph showed a blonde, 3-year-old girl with bright eyes and an infectious smile, features that bore a striking resemblance to Ashley Martinez, allowing for the changes that 15 years of growth would naturally produce. But it was the case details that made Morrison pause and reach for her phone to call Dr. Webb. Lily Chen had disappeared from Millbrook Falls, Pennsylvania in October 2002, which would make her approximately 18 years old in 2018, matching Ashley's current age within a reasonable margin of error. More significantly, the case notes mentioned that Lily's father, David Chen, had been considered a person of interest due to inconsistencies in his timeline and evidence suggesting possible domestic violence in the household. Morrison contacted Detective Sarah Kowalski, who had maintained unofficial oversight of the Lily Chen case even as it grew cold. Kowalski, now a lieutenant with 15 years of additional experience, remembered every detail of the case that had haunted her early career. When Morrison explained about Ashley's bone fractures and the possibility of a connection to Lily's disappearance, Kowalski agreed to meet immediately. "The Chen case never felt solved to me," Kowalski admitted during their meeting at the state police barracks. "We had a father with a history of losing his temper, evidence of recent cleaning at the house, and inconsistencies in his story about the night before Lily disappeared. But we never found a body, never got a confession, and never had enough evidence to make an arrest. If this girl Ashley is actually Lily Chen, it changes everything." The two women began comparing Ashley's physical characteristics with the details from Lily's missing person report. Height and weight projections based on Lily's growth charts at age 3 suggested she would be approximately Ashley's current size. Hair color could have darkened naturally over 15 years, but bone structure and facial features showed promising similarities. Most compelling was a small scar on Ashley's left ankle, a mark that Emma Chen had specifically mentioned in her daughter's missing person report, the result of a minor accident with a bicycle when Lily was 2 years old. Dr. Webb provided additional medical evidence that supported the potential connection. The timeline of Ashley's bone fractures corresponded with the period when Lily Chen would have been living with her parents in Millbrook Falls. The pattern of injuries suggested ongoing abuse that escalated over time, consistent with Detective Kowalski's suspicions about David Chen's involvement in his daughter's disappearance. But establishing Ashley's true identity would require more than circumstantial evidence. Morrison initiated the process of requesting DNA testing, which would provide definitive proof if biological samples from Emma Chen could be obtained for comparison. The legal process was complex, requiring court orders and careful handling of Ashley's rights as a minor in foster care who might be the victim of a decades-old crime. Emma Chen, now Emma Patterson following her remarriage, received the phone call that would change her life on a Thursday evening in March 2018. Lieutenant Kowalski explained the situation carefully, emphasizing that the investigation was still preliminary but that there was reason to believe her daughter might be alive. Emma's response was a mixture of hope and disbelief. 15 years of grief and acceptance, suddenly challenged by the possibility that her worst nightmare might have been something entirely different. "I never stopped hoping," Emma later said. "But hoping and believing are different things. After all those years, you learn to live with the assumption that your child is gone forever. To suddenly be told that she might be alive, that she might be just 3 hours away in Pittsburgh, it was like being asked to rebuild your entire understanding of reality." The DNA testing process took several weeks, during which Morrison worked carefully to prepare Ashley for the possibility that her entire understanding of her identity might change. Ashley had been told only that there were questions about her early childhood, and that investigators were trying to locate her biological family. The full implications of what the DNA test might reveal were kept confidential to protect her emotional well-being. Meanwhile, Detective Kowalski began the process of reopening the Lily Chen case officially. 15 years of advances in forensic science meant that evidence preserved from the original investigation could be re-examined with new techniques. The house where the Chens had lived had been sold multiple times, but Kowalski arranged for a forensic team to conduct a fresh examination of the property, looking for evidence that might have been missed during the original search. The results were startling. Advanced luminol testing revealed blood evidence in the basement that had not been detected in 2002. The pattern suggested that someone had attempted to clean up significant bloodshed, but microscopic traces had persisted beneath the surface. Additional testing found DNA evidence that would later be matched to both Lily Chen and David Chen, providing the first concrete evidence that a violent crime had occurred in the house. Dr. Marcus Webb continued to work with Ashley, helping her process the psychological implications of learning about her traumatic early childhood. The bone fractures told a story of systematic abuse that Ashley herself had no conscious memory of experiencing. Recovery of such deeply buried trauma required careful therapeutic intervention to prevent re-traumatization while allowing Ashley to understand her own history. The investigation also revealed how thoroughly David Chen had planned his daughter's disappearance. Financial records from 2002 showed that he had withdrawn significant amounts of cash in the weeks before Lily vanished. Phone records indicated contact with individuals in Ohio who were later identified as part of an informal network that helped people disappear, sometimes legitimately to escape abusive relationships, but sometimes to avoid criminal prosecution. Ashley's transformation from a missing toddler into an unidentifiable foster child had required criminal expertise that went beyond what most people would be capable of organizing on their own. Someone had helped David Chen erase his daughter's identity so completely that she had spent 13 years in the foster care system without anyone connecting her to a missing child case. As the DNA results were processed, Emma Chen began the emotional process of preparing to possibly reunite with a daughter who had no memory of her. The 3-year-old who had disappeared from her kitchen had become a 17-year-old young woman with her own life, relationships, and plans for the future. The reunion they had both dreamed of would be complicated by the reality that they were now strangers separated by 15 years of completely different experiences. The case was beginning to attract media attention as word spread through law enforcement channels about the potential breakthrough. But Morrison and Kowalski worked to keep details confidential until the DNA results could provide definitive answers about Ashley's true identity, and until David Chen could be located and questioned about his role in what was now clearly a criminal conspiracy. The envelope containing Ashley Martinez's DNA test results arrived at Janet Morrison's office on a Wednesday morning in April 2018. Morrison had handled hundreds of similar cases throughout her career, but few had carried the emotional weight of potentially reuniting a mother with a daughter who had been missing for over 15 years. As she opened the laboratory report, Morrison understood that the next phone call she made would either bring closure to a family that had endured unimaginable loss or force her to continue searching for answers in a case that seemed to defy resolution. The results were unambiguous. Ashley Martinez was genetically matched to Emma Chen with a probability exceeding 99.9%. After 15 years of uncertainty, Emma's daughter was finally coming home. Lieutenant Sarah Kowalski received Morrison's call while reviewing case files at her desk. The confirmation that Ashley was indeed Lily Chen transformed what had been a missing person case into an active criminal investigation involving kidnapping, child abuse, and conspiracy. Kowalski immediately contacted the district attorney's office to discuss charges against David Chen, who had been located in Eugene, Oregon, where he worked as a maintenance supervisor for an apartment complex. Emma Chen's reaction to the news was complex. Joy at learning her daughter was alive, mixed with grief for the 15 years they had lost, and anger at the deception that had stolen those years from both of them. I had mourned my daughter, Emma later reflected. I had built a life around the assumption that she was dead. To learn that she had been alive all this time, growing up with strangers while I searched for her grave, it was like being asked to resurrect not just her, but myself as the mother I had been before she disappeared. The logistical challenges of reuniting Ashley with her biological family were unprecedented in Morrison's experience. Ashley had no conscious memory of her life before age 5, had developed her identity as Ashley Martinez over 13 years in foster care, and was now just months away from aging out of the system and beginning her adult life. The psychological trauma of learning that her entire understanding of her identity was based on a criminal deception required careful therapeutic intervention. Dr. Webb worked closely with trauma specialists to develop a plan for helping Ashley process the revelation. The young woman's initial reaction was disbelief, followed by confusion about what this information meant for her sense of self. Ashley had spent years in therapy dealing with the abandonment issues that stemmed from being found alone in that Ohio motel room. Learning that she hadn't been abandoned but rather kidnapped and hidden by her own father created a different kind of trauma that required different therapeutic approaches. The most difficult aspect was helping Ashley understand that nothing about who she had become was false. Dr. Webb explained. Her experiences in foster care, her relationships with the Martinez family, her plans for college, all of that remained real and valid. But she also had to integrate the reality of having a biological family who had never stopped looking for her. Detective Kowalski began the process of building a criminal case against David Chen. The DNA evidence from the basement of the family's former home, combined with Ashley's bone fractures and the evidence of systematic abuse they represented, provided a foundation for multiple felony charges. But prosecuting a 15-year-old crime required careful reconstruction of events that many of the participants had either forgotten or actively suppressed. The investigation revealed that David Chen's plan to make his daughter disappear had been developing for months before October 2002. Financial records showed he had been struggling with gambling debts and had borrowed money from individuals with criminal connections. Phone records indicated that he had been in contact with people who specialized in creating false identities and helping individuals vanish from their former lives. The network that had helped David Chen had operated across multiple states, taking advantage of gaps in communication between different child welfare systems. By transporting Lily from Pennsylvania to Ohio and abandoning her there with no identifying information, they had effectively severed any connection between the missing child in one state and the unidentified child found in another. Emma began the delicate process of reaching out to Ashley through Morrison and Dr. Webb. Initial contact was limited to letters and photographs, allowing Ashley to control the pace of their reconnection. Emma shared memories of Lily's early childhood, stories about bedtime songs, favorite toys, and family traditions that might trigger buried memories. She also provided current information about her life, her remarriage to Robert, and the extended family that had never stopped hoping for Lily's return. Ashley's response was cautious, but increasingly curious. She began experiencing what Dr. Webb identified as recovered memories, fragments of her early childhood that had been suppressed by trauma, but were now surfacing as her sense of safety increased. The yellow kitchen curtains that Emma described triggered a particularly strong response, along with memories of a woman's voice singing Chinese lullabies that her grandmother had taught Emma. The Martinez family faced their own emotional challenges as they prepared to support Ashley through this transition. They had loved and raised Ashley for 3 crucial years of her adolescence, and the prospect of her reuniting with her biological family created complicated feelings about their role in her life. But their primary concern was Ashley's well-being, and they worked closely with social services to ensure that any transition would be gradual and voluntary. Public interest in the case intensified as news media picked up the story. The tale of a toddler who had disappeared in 2002 and been found 15 years later as a teenager in foster care captured national attention. But Morrison and Kowalski worked to protect Ashley's privacy while building the criminal case against David Chen, who had been arrested at his workplace in Oregon and was fighting extradition to Pennsylvania. David Chen's arrest revealed additional evidence of the conspiracy that had hidden Lily's identity. Documents found in his Oregon apartment included false identification papers and contact information for individuals who had helped him disappear his daughter. The investigation expanded to include federal agencies, as the crime had crossed state lines and involved organized criminal activity. Ashley's first face-to-face meeting with Emma was arranged for a Saturday afternoon in May 2018, in a neutral setting at the Child Services Office with counselors present to provide support. Emma arrived carrying a photo album filled with pictures of Lily's first 3 years of life, hoping that visual cues might help trigger additional memories. Ashley brought a notebook where she had written down questions about her early childhood and the family she couldn't remember. The meeting was emotional, but carefully structured. Emma had prepared for the possibility that Ashley might not feel any immediate connection to her, and Ashley had been counseled to expect that biological relationships don't automatically create emotional bonds. But when Emma showed Ashley a photograph of herself at age 2, wearing a distinctive yellow dress and standing next to a small tricycle, Ashley experienced what she later described as a moment of recognition, not conscious memory, but a feeling of familiarity that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. It wasn't like the movies, Ashley later said. I didn't suddenly remember everything or feel like I had found my missing piece. But looking at Emma, I could see my own features reflected in her face. And there was something about her voice when she said my real name, Lily, that felt like coming home to a place I had forgotten I was looking for. The reunion marked the beginning of a long process of rebuilding a relationship between a mother and daughter who had become strangers. Emma had to learn to love the young woman Ashley had become, while Ashley had to decide whether she wanted to reclaim the identity of Lily Chen or continue as Ashley Martinez while building a relationship with her biological family. The criminal case against David Chen continued to develop as prosecutors prepared for trial. The evidence of systematic child abuse, kidnapping, and conspiracy to hide a crime provided grounds for multiple felony charges that could result in decades of imprisonment. But the legal proceedings would also require Ashley to testify about experiences she had no conscious memory of, adding another layer of complexity to her ongoing recovery. David Chen's extradition from Oregon to Pennsylvania took place on a humid morning in June 2018. As he was transported in shackles from the airport to the Allegheny County Jail, Chen appeared to be a man who had been carrying a heavy burden for 15 years. His hair had gone completely gray, his face bore the weathered lines of someone who had been drinking heavily for more than a decade, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had been running from his own conscience for far too long. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Kowalski observed Chen during his initial booking process. The man she remembered from 2002 had been defensive, angry, and combative during questioning. The David Chen who sat across from her in the interview room in 2018 seemed deflated, as if the arrest had finally given him permission to stop pretending that his secret could remain buried forever. 15 years is a long time to carry that kind of guilt, Kowalski later reflected. When we finally had him in custody with DNA evidence that proved what had happened, I think part of him was relieved. He had been living with the knowledge that his daughter was alive somewhere, but that he could never see her or acknowledge what he had done. That's a special kind of prison. Chen's attorney, a public defender named Michael Rodriguez, found himself representing a client who seemed almost eager to confess. During their first meeting, Chen made it clear that he wanted to tell the truth about what had happened to Lily, not to avoid prosecution, but to finally explain the events that had haunted him for 15 years. Rodriguez advised against making any statements until they could negotiate with prosecutors, but Chen insisted that some stories needed to be told regardless of the legal consequences. The confession, when it came, revealed a crime that was both more calculated and more desperate than investigators had originally theorized. David Chen's statement, given over the course of 3 days in late June 2018, provided the missing pieces of a puzzle that had mystified law enforcement for over a decade. Chen began by acknowledging what the physical evidence had already proven, that he had been abusing his daughter for months before her disappearance. "I was drinking too much," he said. "Work was stressful, we had money problems, and when Lily would cry or act up, I would lose my temper. It started with just grabbing her too hard when I was disciplining her, but it escalated. Emma worked during the day, and I was home with Lily more often. The drinking made everything worse. The abuse had been systematic and increasingly violent." Chen described incidents where he had shaken Lily hard enough to cause the skull fractures that Dr. Webb had identified, and times when he had grabbed her arms or ribs with enough force to break bones. Emma had noticed some of the injuries, but Chen had convinced her they were the result of normal childhood accidents. Falls from playground equipment, bumps against furniture, the typical bruises and scrapes that active toddlers accumulate. Emma suspected something was wrong. Chen admitted. She started asking more questions about how Lily got hurt, and she was talking about taking her to the doctor for a complete checkup. I knew that if a doctor examined Lily carefully, they would see the pattern of injuries. Emma would know what I had been doing, and I would go to prison. The night before Lily's disappearance, Chen had lost control completely. Lily had been crying inconsolably, something that had always triggered his anger, and in his intoxicated state, he had struck her hard enough to cause significant bleeding from a head wound. As Lily lay unconscious on the basement floor, Chen believed he had killed his daughter. "I thought she was dead," Chen said. "There was so much blood, and she wasn't moving. I panicked completely. I started planning to hide what I had done, to make it look like she had disappeared so that Emma wouldn't know I had killed our daughter." But as Chen worked through the night to clean up the blood and plan how to dispose of Lily's body, the little girl regained consciousness. She was severely injured and disoriented, but alive. This created a different kind of crisis for Chen. He couldn't seek medical attention without revealing the abuse, but he also couldn't bring himself to finish what he thought he had already done. The solution came from an unexpected source. Chen had accumulated significant gambling debts with individuals who operated outside the law, and he had previously discussed the possibility of disappearing from his debts and starting over with a new identity. When he called his criminal contacts in desperation, they offered an alternative. They could make Lily disappear instead, ensuring that she would never be able to identify him as her abuser, while also eliminating the witness to his crimes. "They told me they knew people who could take her somewhere. She would be safe, but where she could never come back to testify against me," Chen explained. "They said children that young don't remember much anyway, and that she would be better off with a new family who didn't know about the abuse. I convinced myself that I was protecting her." The network that helped Chen consisted of individuals who specialized in human trafficking, but who also occasionally helped abusive parents make their children disappear rather than face criminal prosecution. The operation involved transporting children across state lines, erasing their identities, and abandoning them in locations where they would be found by authorities and placed in foster care systems that had no way to connect them to their original families. Lily was taken from the house while Emma was at work on that Friday in October 2002. Chen had sedated her with medication to keep her quiet during transport, and by the time Emma returned home, the little girl was already on her way to Ohio. Chen then staged the scene to make it appear that Lily had wandered off, opening the front door and creating evidence that suggested she had left the house on her own. The hardest part was watching Emma search for Lily, knowing that our daughter was alive, but that I could never tell her the truth, Chen said. Emma blamed herself for not watching Lily more carefully, and I let her carry that guilt because I was too much of a coward to admit what I had really done. Chen's confession revealed that he had maintained minimal contact with the criminal network for several years after Lily's disappearance, receiving occasional updates that confirmed she was alive and in foster care, but providing no details about her location or new identity. By 2007, even those limited communications had stopped, leaving Chen with no knowledge of whether his daughter was alive or dead. The guilt had consumed Chen's remaining relationships. His marriage to Emma collapsed under the strain of grief and suspicion, and his move to Oregon had been an attempt to escape the constant reminders of his crimes. But the alcohol abuse had continued, and Chen had never been able to form lasting relationships or find peace with what he had done. I knew that someday this would catch up with me. Chen concluded, every time I saw a missing child story on the news, every time someone mentioned Lily's case, I knew that the truth would eventually come out. Part of me wanted it to come out. Living with that secret was its own kind of death sentence. Chen's confession provided prosecutors with the evidence they needed to file comprehensive charges, including kidnapping, child abuse, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. But it also provided Ashley, Lily, with answers to questions she hadn't even known she should ask. The truth about her disappearance was more complex than a simple abandonment or kidnapping by strangers. Her own father had orchestrated her disappearance to avoid accountability for the abuse he had inflicted on her. Dr. Webb worked with Ashley to process this information carefully. Learning that her father had not only abused her, but had also deliberately erased her identity and separated her from her mother, created a different kind of trauma that required specialized therapeutic intervention. Ashley had to reconcile the physical evidence of her abuse with the absence of conscious memories, while also processing the reality that someone who was supposed to protect her had instead become the source of her greatest harm. The confession also provided Emma with answers she had needed for 15 years, but at the cost of learning that her husband had not only killed the man she thought she knew, but had also stolen 15 years of her daughter's childhood, while forcing Emma to live with the guilt of believing she had failed to protect her child. The criminal network that had helped David Chen was also under investigation by federal authorities. Chen's cooperation in identifying his co-conspirators led to arrests across 3 states, and revealed an operation that had been helping abusive parents make their children disappear for more than 2 decades. Ashley's case was just one of dozens that investigators were now re-examining, hoping to reunite other families and bring other perpetrators to justice. As Chen awaited trial, he made one final request through his attorney. He wanted to write a letter to his daughter, not seeking forgiveness, but simply acknowledging the harm he had caused, and expressing his hope that she could build a good life despite the trauma he had inflicted. Ashley chose not to read the letter immediately, but Dr. Webb preserved it for a time, when she might be ready to confront her father's words about the choices that had shaped both their lives. The summer of 2018 became a season of careful reconstruction for both Emma and Ashley as they navigated the complex process of rebuilding a mother-daughter relationship that had been severed by violence and deception 15 years earlier. Emma had rearranged her life around grief and loss, while Ashley had built her identity within the foster care system, creating bonds and developing independence that couldn't be easily transferred to a biological family she didn't remember. Emma approached the reunion with a mixture of desperate hope and practical understanding of the challenges they faced. She had spent 15 years imagining what it would be like to hold her daughter again, but the reality was that Ashley was no longer the 3-year-old who had disappeared from their kitchen. She was a young woman with her own opinions, relationships, and plans for the future, including a college scholarship to study social work that she had earned through years of academic achievement, despite the instability of foster care. I had to learn to love the person Ashley had become, not just mourn the childhood that had been stolen from us, Emma later explained. She wasn't the little girl I remembered, and I wasn't the same mother I had been 15 years ago. We were both different people, and we had to decide whether we wanted to build something new together. Ashley faced her own internal conflicts about embracing her identity as Lily Chen. She had spent 13 years as Ashley Martinez, developing relationships with foster families, social workers, teachers, and friends who knew her by that name and had supported her through the challenges of growing up in the system. The prospect of reclaiming her birth identity felt like potentially betraying the people who had helped her survive and thrive during the most formative years of her adolescence. Dr. Webb worked with both Emma and Ashley to establish realistic expectations for their relationship. Unlike the reunion fantasies that had sustained Emma through years of grief, the reality of reconnecting required patience, counseling, and acceptance that some damage couldn't be completely healed. Ashley had no conscious memories of her life before age 5, which meant that Emma's stories about Lily's early childhood felt like learning about a stranger rather than recovering her own past. The Martinez family played a crucial role in supporting Ashley's transition. Rather than viewing Emma's reappearance as a threat to their relationship with Ashley, they embraced the opportunity to help her build connections to her biological family while maintaining the bonds they had formed. Carmen Martinez, Ashley's foster mother, became an unexpected ally for Emma, helping her understand the young woman Ashley had become and the experiences that had shaped her personality. Ashley had been part of our family for 3 years, Carmen Martinez explained. We loved her, and love doesn't diminish when it's shared with more people. Emma was Ashley's mother, but we had also been her family during some very important years. Our job was to help her figure out how to honor both parts of her story. Ashley's relationship with Emma developed gradually through supervised visits that slowly expanded in duration and intimacy. Emma shared photographs, stories, and family traditions that had been preserved from Lily's early childhood. She brought traditional Chinese recipes that Lily's grandmother had taught Emma, hoping that familiar tastes might trigger buried memories. Some sessions produced moments of recognition, a particular song that seemed familiar, a gesture that felt like muscle memory, but Ashley's conscious recall of her early childhood remained limited. The process was complicated by Ashley's need to testify in the criminal case against David Chen. Prosecutors required her to provide evidence about the abuse she had suffered, even though she had no conscious memory of the events. Dr. Webb worked with legal specialists to develop techniques for helping Ashley access suppressed memories while protecting her psychological well-being. The testimony would be crucial for ensuring that Chen faced appropriate consequences for his crimes, but it also forced Ashley to confront the reality of her traumatic early childhood. Emma struggled with her own complex feelings about the man she had once loved and married. David Chen's confession had revealed that their entire life together had been built on deception and violence. She had to process not only grief for the years lost with her daughter, but also anger at being deceived and guilt for not recognizing the signs of abuse that had been occurring in her own home. I kept thinking about all the times I noticed Lily was hurt, and David explained it away, Emma said. I was her mother. I should have known. I should have protected her. Learning that David had been hurting her while I was at work, that I had left her alone with the person who was causing her pain, that guilt was almost harder to bear than thinking she was dead. Therapy helped Emma understand that recognizing systematic child abuse within a family is often difficult, especially when the abuser is skilled at manipulation and deception. David Chen had deliberately hidden his abuse and had exploited Emma's trust to avoid detection. But accepting this intellectually was different from releasing the emotional burden of feeling responsible for her daughter's suffering. Ashley began experiencing fragments of recovered memory as her sense of safety increased and her relationship with Emma developed. The memories came in pieces. The sound of her father's angry voice, the feeling of being hurt, the fear that had surrounded her daily life during those early years. But she also recovered positive memories. Emma singing lullabies, the comfort of being held, the security she had felt with her mother before everything changed. The most significant breakthrough came during a visit to Emma's current home, where she had recreated some elements of the kitchen where Lily had spent her earliest years. When Emma hung yellow curtains similar to the ones that had been in their old kitchen, Ashley experienced what Dr. Webb identified as a profound recovered memory episode. She suddenly remembered standing on a stool by the window, watching for her father's truck, and feeling both excitement and anxiety about his arrival home. It was like a door opening in my mind, Ashley later described. I could suddenly remember being little, remember Emma as my mom, remember feeling safe with her, and scared of him. It wasn't complete. There were still huge gaps, but for the first time, I could connect the person I am now with the child I used to be. The memory recovery process was emotionally intense and sometimes overwhelming. Ashley had to process not only the return of traumatic memories, but also the grief of understanding how much of her childhood had been lost. The little girl who had disappeared from Millbrook Falls would never be fully recovered, but the young woman who had survived could begin to integrate both parts of her story. Emma and Ashley decided that Ashley would legally reclaim her birth name, while continuing to use Martinez as part of her identity, honoring both her biological family and the foster family that had raised her. The decision represented a compromise that acknowledged the complexity of her situation and her need to maintain connections to all the people who had helped her survive and grow. As Ashley's 18th birthday approached in the fall of 2018, she faced decisions about her future that were complicated by her dual identity. The college scholarship she had earned was in the name of Ashley Martinez, but she wanted to pursue her education as Lily Chen Martinez, incorporating both aspects of her history. Emma offered to help her navigate the bureaucratic challenges of changing legal documents while maintaining her academic opportunities. The relationship between Emma and Ashley continued to evolve as they learned to navigate the normal challenges of a mother-daughter relationship alongside the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them back together. They disagreed about typical things: Ashley's college choices, her boyfriend, her career plans, but they also had to address the unique challenges of building trust and intimacy between two people who were genetically family but had become strangers through circumstance. Dr. Webb observed that their reunion was progressing more successfully than many similar cases he had encountered. Both Emma and Ashley had realistic expectations about what their relationship could become, and both were committed to doing the difficult emotional work required to build something meaningful together. The foundation of love that had existed during Lily's first 3 years of life hadn't been completely destroyed by the trauma that followed. It had been buried but not erased. Ashley's testimony against David Chen was scheduled for early 2019, which would mark the final phase of bringing her father to justice for the crimes that had stolen her childhood and separated her from her family. The legal proceedings would provide official closure to the case, but the work of rebuilding their relationship would continue long after the courtroom drama had ended. The trial of David Chen began on a cold January morning in 2019 in the same Allegheny County courthouse where 15 years earlier, a judge had declared Lily Chen legally dead after 7 years of fruitless searching. Now the young woman who had once been that missing toddler sat in the witness section, preparing to testify against the father whose crimes had stolen her childhood and traumatized her family. Ashley's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, but it required careful handling due to the unique circumstances of her memory recovery. District Attorney Maria Rodriguez had worked with Dr. Webb and trauma specialists to develop an approach that would allow Ashley to provide evidence about her abuse without re-traumatizing her through the legal process. Ashley would testify about her recovered memories, supported by medical evidence of her historical injuries and corroborated by David Chen's own confession. "I remember being afraid of him," Ashley told the jury, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words. "I don't remember all the specific times he hurt me, but I remember the feeling of never being safe when he was around. I remember hiding, and I remember pain, and I remember my mom's voice trying to comfort me afterward." Emma's testimony provided context for the family dynamics that had enabled David Chen's abuse to continue undetected. She described the gradual changes in Lily's behavior during the months before her disappearance, increased fearfulness, reluctance to be alone with her father, and injuries that David had explained away as typical childhood accidents. Emma's guilt about missing the signs of abuse was evident as she testified, but prosecutors helped the jury understand how skilled abusers manipulate family members to avoid detection. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Kowalski presented the forensic evidence that had ultimately solved the case: the DNA analysis that proved Ashley was Lily Chen, the blood evidence from the basement that corroborated Chen's confession, and the bone fracture patterns that documented systematic abuse over an extended period. Kowalski's 15-year dedication to the case demonstrated the persistence that had eventually brought Chen to justice. The defense, led by public defender Michael Rodriguez, faced the challenging task of representing a client who had already confessed to the crimes. Rather than disputing the facts, Rodriguez focused on mitigating factors: Chen's alcoholism, his gambling debts, his claimed remorse for his actions. The strategy was designed to potentially reduce sentencing rather than achieve acquittal, given the overwhelming evidence of Chen's guilt. David Chen himself chose to testify, against his attorney's advice. His appearance in court was jarring for those who remembered the man from 2002. 15 years of guilt and alcohol abuse had aged him dramatically. His testimony was an attempt to explain his actions rather than excuse them, providing additional details about the desperation and panic that had led him to hide his daughter rather than seek help for his abuse. "I know there's no excuse for what I did," Chen told the court. "I hurt my daughter. I stole 15 years from her and from Emma, and I've lived with that guilt every day since. I was a coward who chose to protect himself instead of protecting his child. I deserve whatever punishment this court decides to impose." Chen's testimony revealed additional details about the criminal network that had helped him hide Lily. The organization had operated across multiple states, helping abusive parents make their children disappear in exchange for significant payments. Chen had paid nearly $30,000, money borrowed from loan sharks, to ensure that Lily would be transported to Ohio and abandoned in a way that would make it impossible for authorities to connect her to her original identity. The trial also heard from Carmen Martinez, Ashley's foster mother, who testified about the young woman Ashley had become, despite the trauma of her early childhood. Martinez described Ashley's resilience, her academic achievements, and her determination to pursue a career in social work, helping other children who had experienced abuse and neglect. The testimony provided the jury with a picture of the strength Ashley had developed and the positive future she was building despite her traumatic past. Dr. Webb's testimony explained the medical and psychological evidence that had made it possible to identify Ashley as Lily Chen and to understand the scope of abuse she had suffered. The bone fractures told a story of systematic violence that had escalated over time, while Ashley's psychological recovery demonstrated both the lasting impact of childhood trauma and the human capacity for healing when provided with appropriate support and safety. The prosecution's closing argument emphasized that David Chen's crimes had extended far beyond the physical abuse of his daughter. By hiding Lily and allowing Emma to believe she was dead, Chen had inflicted 15 years of unnecessary grief on his wife. By erasing Lily's identity and forcing her into the foster care system, he had deprived her of her family, her culture, and her sense of belonging. The crimes had ripple effects that extended across decades and affected multiple lives. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: kidnapping, child abuse, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The speed of their decision reflected the overwhelming evidence of Chen's guilt and the compelling testimony from his victims about the impact of his crimes. Judge Patricia Williams scheduled sentencing for the following month, allowing time for victim impact statements from Emma and Ashley. The sentencing phase would provide both women with an opportunity to address Chen directly about how his actions had affected their lives, while also giving the judge information needed to determine appropriate punishment for crimes that had caused such extensive harm. Emma's victim impact statement was delivered with the controlled emotion of someone who had spent 15 years processing grief and anger. She spoke about the years of searching for her daughter, the guilt she had carried about failing to protect Lily, and the complex process of rebuilding their relationship after learning the truth. But she also spoke about forgiveness, not as absolution for Chen's crimes, but as a necessary step in her own healing process. "You stole 15 years from my daughter and from me," Emma told Chen. "You forced both of us to live with trauma and loss that could have been avoided if you had been brave enough to get help instead of hiding what you had done. But Lily survived, and she's become an amazing young woman despite what you did to her. That strength came from her, not from you, and it's what will allow both of us to move forward." Ashley's statement was more complex, reflecting the ongoing process of integrating her recovered memories with her current identity. She spoke about the confusion of learning that her entire understanding of her childhood had been based on a lie, the difficulty of processing trauma she couldn't fully remember, and the ongoing work of building a relationship with a mother who had become a stranger. But Ashley also spoke about resilience and the power of truth to promote healing. "I may not remember everything you did to me," she told her father, "but I remember enough to know that you chose violence over protection and deception over taking responsibility. I've spent 15 years learning how to trust people and how to believe I deserve to be safe. Your choices made that much harder, but they didn't make it impossible." Judge Williams sentenced David Chen to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The sentence reflected the severity of his crimes, while also acknowledging his cooperation in solving the case and helping to dismantle the criminal network that had assisted him. Chen would be in his 70s before becoming eligible for parole, ensuring that he would spend the majority of his remaining life in prison. The sentencing brought legal closure to a case that had haunted Millbrook Falls for 15 years, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter for Emma and Ashley as they continued building their relationship without the shadow of pending legal proceedings. The justice system had provided accountability for David Chen's crimes, but the work of healing from those crimes would continue for years to come. Ashley's decision to pursue a career in social work was influenced by her experience with the professionals who had helped her recover her identity and reunite with her family. She wanted to work with children in foster care, helping them navigate the complex challenges of growing up without stable family connections, while also watching for signs that they might be victims of crimes that had never been properly investigated. Emma returned to work at the county clerk's office, but she also became an advocate for missing children's families and for improvements in the communication between different state child welfare systems. Her experience had revealed gaps in the system that allowed children like Lily to disappear from one state and reappear in another without anyone making the connection between a missing child and an unidentified child in care. The criminal network that had helped David Chen was ultimately dismantled through the coordinated efforts of federal and state law enforcement agencies. Several other missing children cases were solved as a result of the investigation, leading to additional reunions and prosecutions. Ashley's case had opened the door to justice for multiple families who had been victimized by the same criminal conspiracy. As 2019 progressed, Emma and Ashley settled into a routine of regular visits and phone calls that felt increasingly natural rather than forced. They were learning to be a family again, acknowledging both the bond they had shared during Lily's early childhood and the reality of the people they had both become during their years apart. The relationship wasn't a return to what had been lost, but rather the creation of something new, built on the foundation of what had survived. By the spring of 2020, Ashley Chen Martinez was completing her sophomore year at the University of Pittsburgh, where she studied social work with a concentration in child welfare and trauma recovery. The young woman who had once been a missing toddler had grown into someone determined to help other children navigate the complex challenges of growing up in the foster care system, while also working to prevent the kinds of crimes that had stolen her own childhood. Emma visited Ashley's campus apartment on a Saturday afternoon in March, bringing homemade dumplings and the ingredients for green tea that had been Lily's favorite drink during her early childhood. These visits had become a cherished ritual, a way for mother and daughter to continue building their relationship while honoring both Ashley's current identity and her recovered connection to her Chinese heritage. "I've been having more dreams lately," Ashley told her mother as they prepared dinner together. "Not nightmares like before, but dreams where I remember being little with you. Yesterday I dreamed about you teaching me to fold paper cranes, and when I woke up, I could actually remember how to do it with my hands, even though I hadn't thought about origami in years." Dr. Webb had explained that Ashley's memory recovery would likely continue for years, triggered by sensory experiences, emotional safety, and the strengthening of her relationship with Emma. The brain's capacity to protect itself from trauma sometimes meant that positive memories were buried alongside traumatic ones, but as Ashley's sense of security increased, more of her early childhood was becoming accessible to her conscious mind. Emma had also been recovering memories, not lost memories, but suppressed ones that guilt and grief had made too painful to examine. As her relationship with Ashley strengthened, Emma found herself remembering the joy of Lily's early childhood alongside the fear and confusion of her disappearance. She could now think about bedtime stories and morning cuddles without being overwhelmed by the loss that had followed. The criminal case against David Chen had concluded with his imprisonment, but the ripple effects of the investigation continued to unfold. The federal task force that had dismantled the criminal network responsible for hiding abused children had solved 17 additional missing children cases, leading to reunions between families who had been separated for decades. Ashley's case had become a catalyst for systemic changes in how missing children investigations were conducted and how information was shared between different state agencies. Detective Lieutenant Sarah Kowalski, now promoted to captain, had made the Lily Chen case a template for training other investigators in recognizing and solving cold cases involving missing children. The combination of advancing DNA technology, improved database systems, and persistent detective work had created new opportunities to solve cases that had once seemed hopeless. Ashley's story reminds us that missing children don't always stay missing, Kowalski explained to a conference of law enforcement professionals. Sometimes they grow up in plain sight, in foster care systems, or with relatives, carrying the evidence of crimes that were never solved. Our job is to keep looking, keep asking questions, and keep believing that answers are possible, even when years have passed. The relationship between Emma and Ashley had evolved into something that felt increasingly natural and loving, though it remained different from typical mother-daughter relationships. They were rebuilding intimacy across a 15-year gap, learning each other's personalities, preferences, and perspectives as adults rather than resuming a relationship that had been interrupted during Ashley's toddlerhood. Ashley had chosen to keep both names, legally Lily Chin Martinez, as a way of honoring both her biological family and the foster family that had raised her during her adolescence. Carmen Martinez remained an important figure in Ashley's life, and Emma had developed a friendship with the woman who had provided her daughter with love and stability during the years when Emma couldn't. Carmen gave Lily the teenage years I couldn't, Emma reflected. She helped her develop confidence, supported her academic goals, and showed her what healthy family relationships look like. I'm grateful that Lily had someone who loved her during those years, even though it wasn't me. Ashley's academic work focused on improving the foster care system and developing better methods for identifying children who might be victims of unsolved crimes. Her personal experience had given her insights into the challenges faced by children who age out of foster care without permanent families, as well as the particular needs of children whose identities had been deliberately hidden by abusers. The case had also influenced Emma's perspective on her work and her life. She had become a volunteer advocate for families of missing children, using her experience to provide support and guidance to parents facing the nightmare of a child's disappearance. Emma's story offered hope to families who had been searching for years without answers, demonstrating that resolution was sometimes possible, even when it seemed impossible. Robert, Emma's second husband, had embraced Ashley as part of their family with grace and patience. He understood that Emma would always carry the experience of losing and finding her daughter, and he supported both women as they continued to navigate the ongoing process of rebuilding their relationship. Robert's steady presence had provided Emma with the emotional stability she needed to be fully present for Ashley's recovery. On a warm evening in May 2020, as Ashley prepared for her junior year of college, she and Emma sat on the porch of Emma's house, watching the sunset and talking about Ashley's plans for the future. Ashley had been accepted into a graduate program in social work that would prepare her to work with traumatized children and families affected by violence. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different? Ashley asked. If David had gotten help instead of doing what he did? Emma considered the question carefully. I think about it sometimes, she admitted. But I've learned that wondering about different choices doesn't change what actually happened. What matters is what we do with the life we have now, and the choices we make going forward. Ashley nodded, understanding that her mother's wisdom had been earned through years of processing grief and trauma. I want to work with kids who are in situations like I was, Ashley said. Not just foster kids, but children who might be victims of crimes that nobody has recognized yet. I want to be the person who notices when something doesn't add up, who asks the right questions. As the evening deepened, Emma began humming a lullaby she had sung to Lily during her early childhood, a Chinese melody her own mother had taught her. Ashley listened with growing recognition and gradually began humming along, the music awakening another recovered memory of being small and safe and loved. I remember that song, Ashley said softly. I remember you singing it to me. It's called Mo Li Hua, Jasmine Flower, Emma explained. My mother sang it to me when I was little, and I sang it to you. It's about beauty that persists even when everything around it changes. The melody hung in the evening air between them, a bridge across 15 years of separation and the foundation for whatever came next. Ashley's story had begun with disappearance and trauma, but it was evolving into something else, a testament to the resilience of love and the power of truth to create healing even in the most difficult circumstances. As Ashley prepared to return to campus the next morning, she hugged her mother with the easy affection that had gradually replaced the awkwardness of their early reunions. They were no longer strangers trying to reconstruct a lost relationship, but family members building something new while honoring what had survived. I love you, Mom, Ashley said, using the word that had once felt foreign but now felt natural. I love you too, sweetheart, Emma replied, holding her daughter and thinking about all the years they had lost and all the years they still had to share. Dr. Webb, who continued to work with both women as they navigated ongoing challenges, observed that their relationship had become a model for how families could heal from even the most devastating trauma. The process had required years of patience, professional support, and commitment to honest communication, but it had resulted in genuine healing and connection. Ashley's transformation from a missing toddler to a thriving young adult preparing for a career helping other vulnerable children represented the kind of resilience that trauma specialists hope to foster in all their patients. Her ability to integrate the recovered memories of her early childhood with the identity she had developed in foster care demonstrated the human capacity to create meaning and purpose from even the most difficult experiences. The case of Lily Chen had officially closed with David Chen's conviction, but its impact continued to ripple through the lives of everyone it had touched. For Emma and Ashley, it had meant the end of 15 years of grief and uncertainty, and the beginning of a relationship that honored both their shared past and their individual futures. The yellow curtains that had witnessed Lily's disappearance had been replaced long ago, but the memory of that morning in 2002 no longer carried only pain. It had become part of a larger story, one that included trauma and loss, but also resilience, love, and the extraordinary power of truth to create the possibility for healing and hope. If stories like Ashley's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, the melodies of love continue to play, waiting to guide us home. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more stories that touch the soul and inspire the heart.